We will now be going to the next presentation, the title of which is Improving Jamaica's Productivity and Engineering Perspective. Now, as you can see, the trend that we're going through, we're trying to get us thinking through this COVID time. How can we become more productive? So we have Mr. Jonathan Isaacs here who will be doing a presentation. Jonathan is an industrial engineer. And as an industrial engineer, Jonathan, I'm sure your job is to ensure that we put all of the tools together, the engineering arm, the management arm, the business arm, to make us more productive, right? His professional experience spans a diverse mix of industries, both regionally and locally, within the private and public sector. So we're talking about somebody who has been upfront, not just in the book work, he has done the work, he has been in the field. And therefore, we're looking forward to Jonathan bringing his ideas to how we can be more productive from an engineering standpoint. He has a diploma in mechanical engineer with a production minor and a bachelor's in engineering in industrial engineering with an engineering management minor from the University of Technology. He's also had several certifications on Lean Sigma, Energy Management, and Scrum. So let's be honest, Jonathan is very well qualified to speak on the topic. Jonathan, welcome to JIE's Engineers Week, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say and how you can help us to be more productive. Over to you, Jonathan.
Over to you. Thank you, Natalie, for that introduction. Certainly, it's a pleasure, I must say, to have this opportunity to share with you guys something that I'm very much passionate about. And this is the whole concept and the whole theme of productivity. This is something that I'm really passionate about. Now, so I'll go right into the presentation. So I'll look at my outline. Right, so what I want to do today is to set the context for the presentation today. So in my outline here, I have introduction, which I'll be looking at a particular case within the Jamaica Productivity Center where we would have collected a series of data, which I'll share with you today in terms of the context related to productivity. Importantly, I want to share with you as well why productivity is something that is important and what is productivity. And then we'll go a bit into the methodology in terms of the specific case that I want to share with you guys. We'll look a little into the results and of course, some of the possible solutions. And finally, we'll conclude and give a summary. I must say, by listening to several of the presentations before, I think it makes my job a little bit easier in the sense that they would have touched on some key components which definitely would highlight or reiterate the need for productivity, especially at a time like this in our country. So going forward, we'll go into the purpose. So the purpose of the case study was to investigate productivity gaps found in organizations operating within the private and public sector. Additionally, the study seeks to provide possible solutions that are grounded in engineering tools and techniques that are able to improve productivity levels of these organizations and by extension, the country. So essentially what we're really getting at here is really, we don't want to look at productivity in isolation in the sense that, we're saying we're improving productivity just to improve it for improving its sake, but we want to ultimately have that transcend now to another level, which is, of course, improving the productivity of our country. Now, I'll start off with this little thing here that I'm sharing in terms of productivity. Now, you'll see whatever you want to call them, three guys here, or three persons here, two of which at the front seem to be quite busy moving something forward that appears to be like a cart. Unfortunately, this cart is on what appears to be squared wheels. Now, naturally, you'll understand that, moving that forward will be very difficult, and it will require effort, perhaps, that, putting in that input that will not give you that desired output that you're expecting because the wheels are squared. Now, I'm assuming, which I'm sure maybe you are too, that the person to the far left, or the person behind these guys, is suggesting or providing a possible solution, which is some wheels, and we know wheels to be round, in terms of helping them to solve this problem. But they are adamant that, you know, they are too busy, and so they are rejecting that solution. I have a feeling, a very strong feeling, that that person is actually an engineer coming up with a solution to that problem. Now, when you look at this, I'm sure there are many things that you can derive from it. And, you know, you can put it in context to say, could these two persons at the front be an organization? Could this be organizations? Could this be our country? Could this be our leaders? Could this be, you know, the government in general? And I'm just throwing that out there just for context to say, this is really just highlighting for me. And I found this very interesting, and I thought I would share it with you guys. Now, looking at productivity is something that's very important. And I think we've always tried to set the platform in terms of where we're going when it concerns productivity. And in order to know where we're going, sometimes it's good to look back in terms of where we're coming from. Now, what this graph is really showing is productivity on a global scale in terms of output per worker growth. Now, there is something, I mean, looking at it, you'll see so many things. The red line that moves horizontally across the graph is really the world average in terms of productivity globally from 1951 to about 2019. Now, something I want to highlight specifically though is the downturn of the economy, or the world economy, in 2008, 2009. And if you look at that, you'll see a significant dip, even into the negative, below what the world average was. Now, that to me sends so many signals in terms of what really is happening in that regard. Now, even look at that in that context to say, between 2008 and 2009, that recession was so impactful in terms of how it impacted economies globally. Of course, not excluding us, Jamaica as well. So imagine the impact of what that created. Now let's look in our context right now, what's happening with COVID-19 and what that may have, the impact of, you know, that entire COVID-19, you know, may have on our economy and so forth, even globally, as we are seeing. And a little note here that the World Bank forecasts that global GDP will contract by as much as 5.2%. Now, when we look at that in the local context, we see just recently the PIOJ releasing that the economy in Jamaica has contracted by as much as about 18% between April and June of this year. So already we're starting to see some of the effects of this entire COVID-19 on the effects it has on our economy. Now, taking it in terms of a regional context now, so we're looking at it. So I want you to really follow me, because I'm trying to get out a story here in terms of a progression here. So when we look at the regional context, so these are just some select group of countries, and of course, you know, the research department at the Jamaica Productivity Center does a good job in terms of crunching these numbers and analyzing them. So when we look at it, we look at Jamaica there in the red, and we see Trinidad and Tobago in the light green. And when we look at that gap, of course, we can see, okay, you know, that's kind of alarming. And one of the things that I want to highlight is the fact that productivity in and of itself is something that requires, it's a relative measure. So in other words, it requires to be compared with something else. It cannot stand alone to say, okay, Jamaica's productivity is X, and we just leave it there. It has to be compared relative, you know, to other countries. So when we look at Trinidad there, of course, immediately you see that Trinidad, you know, has a high output in terms of our high productivity in terms of, you know, where they are relative to the others on the graph. And of course, there are many reasons why that could be so. One of which, of course, we understand that Trinidad is a country that has high value added output in terms of oil. So we'll get to that in a minute in terms of the fundamental construct of productivity, and I'm sure it will paint a better picture for you. But something else that I wanted to highlight in terms of this graph is, this graph is looking at labor productivity, same output per worker, which is one of the typical measures of productivity, but highlighted in in black, so those arrows highlighted, and I picked specifically Trinidad and Tobago, Dominican Republic, and Jamaica. Now, if you look at those percentage values, what I did was to kind of superimpose what the labor productivity growth rate was between 2020 to about 2018, 2019 there. And as we can see, Trinidad and Tobago would have had a growth rate of about 42%, 51% for Dominican Republic, and minus 15% for Jamaica. So what the graph is actually showing is the actual productivity numbers for these countries, but what I did was to superimpose the growth rate. So basically the percentage change over the period from 2000 to 2018, 2019 to see what that is. Now, the point I really want to bring across in this is that now we look at productivity. Persons might ask, is productivity something real? And, you know, this would be my response in that regard, because when you look at Trinidad and Tobago, for example, when you look at per capita GDP, so in other words, the GDP by each person, and basically per capita GDP would indicate the richness of a country then, in other words. So when you look at Trinidad and Tobago in 2000, their per capita GDP was about US $6,000. Now, if I'm showing that this productivity growth rate increased by 42% over that period, you can evidently see and clearly see that by 2019, they would have more than, what is this, almost tripled their per capita GDP. So basically, essentially, in other words, Trinidad would have became a much richer country within that roughly 2-decade period. Same for DOMREP, roughly on the same US GDP per capita as Jamaica back in 2000. But the grave difference there is that Jamaica may even manage only to double our GDP capita. DOMREP we see pretty much triple or a little more than triple in terms of their GDP. So the point I'm really wanting to bring across here is that productivity is real, and with productivity growth, you're expected to have a level of increase in terms of your, you know, the value that you get from it in terms of, you know, the country benefiting and the individuals in that country benefiting. Now, I'll take it now locally to a context in Jamaica. So we're still on why. So I'm painting that picture as to why it's so important for us. So this is looking at labor productivity within the goods producing sector. Now, these sectors were not constructed by the Jamaica Productivity Center. This is the raw classification by Statin. What the Jamaica Productivity Center has done is basically to analyze the numbers coming out of these sectors, because we are the authority in terms of crunching productivity numbers and so forth. So what we did was to basically calculate in terms of the research team at the Jamaica Productivity Center. But what I want to highlight here is that agriculture, forestry, and fishing, immediately it's obvious. You can see that, you know, that is one of the, if not the lowest labor productivity as a sector in the goods producing sector. So it begs the question, and I leave that to you to kind of think that through in terms of, you know, especially during a time like this, could we be doing a lot more or much better in terms of our agriculture and fisheries sector and such alike? We'll move right along in terms of our service producing sector. And this is the one that kind of reiterates for us, given the volatility of tourism in terms of our fragility rather, given the fragility of tourism, especially during pandemics, you know, or situations like this. So these numbers were, of course, pre-COVID-19, and you already saw that the hotel and restaurant industry, which is the last bright red line. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize. Apparently, we're having some technical difficulties in that regard. So again, reiterates the need for productivity. All right, so I think we're at the point where we're looking at, in our local context, in terms of our service producing sector. And we're making the point to say that when you look at the last three elements there, the fragility that tourism provides, especially during a time like this, it begs the question in terms of because these numbers are pre-COVID in terms of productivity. So you can just imagine the impact that that would be having now on our sector. I think the presenter immediately before me made a point about us actually looking at improving government services, and that's an area that definitely at some point in time, whether directly or indirectly, as citizens, we must come in contact with the government in terms of the services that they provide us with and vice versa. And so it is imperative upon us to look to that area as well as an opportunity for improvement, and by extension, the way in which the government operates in that regard. So I want to now go a bit into what is productivity. So I purposely started the presentation with a particular flow in terms of reiterating the need for why productivity first, and then now we'll go into what is. So I think that way you may have a better appreciation for what productivity is. So there are several things, several perspectives that will come when you think of productivity. The great thing about productivity, it's not within a tunnel in terms of it's a wide spectrum of involving every sector, involving every involving us on a personal level, in the way we operate as individuals, businesses. So it's very wide. But if we were to look at a formal definition in terms of what productivity is, it's really how efficiently inputs are converted into outputs, and it is usually expressed as a ratio of what you get out in the form of an end product or value added, which we refer to as the output, to what you put in, which could be labor, raw materials, and other resources, which we look at as the input. So to be very explicit, it would be productivity equal to output divided by your output, by your input, sorry. So that is pretty much in terms of a fundamental construct of what productivity is when we look at it from a mathematical expression. So it's really how we are using those inputs to convert to some useful output that will lead to productivity. And of course, by virtue of the expression as a ratio, you can see that if you minimize the inputs, you are able to increase your productivity even by holding outputs constant, and vice versa as well. If you increase your outputs, or if your output is growing at a faster rate than which your inputs are decreasing, of course you'll see increase in productivity in that regard as well. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the center had since 2009 has been collecting data through the technical assistance unit, which I'm a part of, in terms of collecting data in terms of firms within the private and public sector, and of course periodically updating this database in terms of specific productivity challenges and issues that organizations face. Now, the way in which this data was collected would be through, perhaps when we go to do like a productivity audit or consultations, it could be through workshops and trainings that are tailored to meet a specific need. So that's how we would collect that data. And we're looking at about 110 firms that were analyzed for the purposes of this. The center would have maybe worked with a lot more firms, but in terms of what is applicable within this context, it would be about 110 firms. So let's jump right into it. So when we look at it in terms of by sector and industry, and I'm hoping that this is clear enough for you, but when we look at that 37% of firms or organizations or sectors rather, sectors and industries, those would account for government services. So 37% of the complete mix of that 110 would have been from the government service, and the other percentage, which would make up the majority of the rest, would be from the private sector. So we brought down the private sector a lot more because, of course, you would appreciate that, for example, there are different industries and sectors embedded even within the private sector. Government services are just government services. So, for example, different organizations within government that we work with, that's how the classification would work in terms of a sector. So this is just to create context in terms of how the mix of organizations work. Now, one thing that I wanted to look at, or one thing that we want to kind of highlight in that regard, which this is kind of, reiterating that point. Now, the Reparators is a very powerful tool that we use to actually look at some critical, it's known as the 80-20 rule, so, but we use it also to make decisions in terms of the critical few that we would want to focus on for whatever we're doing. So it's applicable right across anything that you're doing. So I thought it would be a good idea to actually look at a Pareto that shows the 20% of industries and sectors that actually contribute to 80% of the firms that we audited. And as you can see, or did interventions with. So as you can see immediately, government services, manufacturing, other education and technology, real estate, renting and business services, agro-processing would fall within that 20%, which contributes to the 80% of the number of firms that within this study. So again, it's kind of like a reiteration then of some of the previous points that were made by the other presenters, in the sense that, in order for us to really move forward government services, we have to optimize that. We have to optimize our manufacturing sector and such like agro-processing, real estate, renting, business services, and so on. So this is just really to create context in terms of, on a deeper level, in terms of the 20% that contribute to 80% of the firms that were audited. Another Pareto that we did, which I think this one would be a little more important, is that we wanted to look at the 20% of productivity challenges or issues faced by these firms, and essentially say that, okay, these 20%, if they were to be solved, it would mean that you're essentially rectifying 80% of the issues that were faced by these companies. So in other words, if we were to solve process inefficiencies, productivity measurement issues within these 20% of firms, that could be used as a measure to say, based on the sample size, that 80% of these companies would be solving the problems that they face. So I purposely put this in also to look at it to say, could this be the case for a wider cross-section, even though yes, within this context it's 110 firms, but could it also be a case for us as a country? There's no business that I know of. Maybe you can share with me, but there's no business that I know of that doesn't have a process embedded within it. So it could be an engineering process, it could be a business process, whatever it is. It could be even a sales firm doing sales. There still has to be an embedded process within that. So could this be a problem that is faced by a wider scope of businesses? Measurement, there's something that is very important when we look at measurement. There's something that says that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And, for me personally, I don't necessarily find it a surprise that, persons may struggle in terms of productivity measurement and actually measuring in general, just measuring in that regard. Some of the other categories, because essentially what we did was to basically categorize then all of the issues into 5 main categories as is listed on this Pareto. So some other of the issues include design limitation, and design limitations in this context, what we're referring to is maybe like persons with layout flow issues in terms of the way in which maybe their manufacturing processes are laid out, maybe the business process, the physical layout of a particular space that leads to greater levels of efficiency. And of course, when we're looking at optimizing processes, we cannot take away or take out the people aspect of it. And so, again, this is not my data that I made up. HR challenges we see coming out as some of the impediments or challenges to productivity faced by some of these entities. And finally, and it's certainly not least, even though it's the least of all in terms of value, but it's certainly not least in terms of the importance, digitization and automation issues that are faced by some of these entities. And as the previous presenter again highlighted, the fourth industrial revolution is something that, we need to really take into effect in terms of ensuring that we're on a path towards improving our productivity in that regard. Now, one of the points I want to make as well, even though it's one of the least of the 5, is the fact that, even especially now during COVID, you'll expect this digitization and automation number to rise, because businesses now are faced with a basically live or die kind of situation, whereby they have to now re-engineer the way of how they do businesses and look at it in terms of the digital aspect of what they do. So I'm expecting that this will be, if we were to continue collecting that data maybe up until maybe next year or to the end of this year, or even right now, beyond right now rather, it would show an increase in that era. Now, I want to put forth some possible solutions to these specific, especially focusing on the top two, because as I said, using the Pareto tool, process inefficiencies, productivity measurement, I think based on that particular sample size of 110, if we're able to solve just those two problems, we'll be solving 80% of all the problems within those businesses. And I think that's why we use tools like the Pareto, which is very powerful in that regard. So I'd like to kind of share some perspective in that regard. So, of course, industrial engineering tools and techniques and methodologies. So these are some of the possible solutions that we could employ. I'm not saying that this is expansive or it's limited only to these, but, and also what I want to highlight as well, this is by no means me saying that, okay, it's only industrial engineering tools that are only going to solve process inefficiencies, but it's just within a context that I'm kind of sharing these. So, for example, Six Sigma is known as a very powerful methodology and tool in terms of solving problems. DMAIC, it's oftentimes referred to as DMAIC in terms of the acronym, which basically speaks to the definition of a particular problem, you measuring that problem, analyzing it, improving it, and putting in measures in place to actually control, to ensure that you are actually within your specified target. So it's a highly statistical methodology that can be applied right across sectors, businesses. It's no limitation in terms of only for manufacturing or only for other sectors or industries. Another one is cause and effect analysis. Oftentimes persons may overlook or think that, because a tool or methodology is simple, they're thinking that it's unable to bring about the required impact that is required. And so cause and effect, be it simple, is one of maybe the most powerful tools, because what this will allow you to do in your business, in your operation, even in your personal life, is to help you with a systematic approach in terms of getting to a root cause and how is this problem, what is causing the problem, and how is it affecting, or what are the effects of this problem, and helping you to develop solutions in that regard. Now, I'm sure my industrial engineering colleagues will be familiar with process maps, flow charts, and of course others as well. Other persons may be familiar, business process model notation. So basically these are tools and techniques and methodologies that you use basically to map a process, not just for mapping its sake, but to actually identify inefficiencies within that process. For example, repetitions. So is there a particular step that is redundant? Is there a step, are there steps that could be merged? Are there steps that could be eliminated? So these are some of the methodologies that could be used or employed in that regard. When we talk about 5S, we talk about, this is actually a very simple organizational optimization technique used by the Japanese. It's called 5S. In fact, 5S in some regards has actually evolved now to 6S, where there's another S called safety. So what it really is about removing waste from a space, from a particular space. We can understand that. Have you ever been in a situation where you're searching for just a document that you may have maybe placed somewhere? Think about you running a business, and every time you have to search for something, that's time that's wasted in that regard. That's money as well. That's resources that are wasted, and that impacts your overall responsiveness to your client. So this is a very simple but effective tool. When we talk about value stream mapping, that's another waste elimination technique, which looks at mapping your entire business process in terms of what happens at the various stages within the process, and also looking at where are the wastes, where are the redundancies, how can I improve in that regard. Kaizen is also another technique. Now, Kaizen, again, another Japanese tool and technique. And you might be wondering why am I highlighting some of these Japanese? Well, at the Jamaica Productivity Center, we have had the opportunity to partner with the JICA, Japanese International Cooperation Agency, where we work and basically sharing a symbiotic relationship in terms of them sharing with us certain Japanese tools and methodologies for improving processes and productivity in various industries. So this is why I'm highlighting some of these. So Kaizen in the context, it's really in simple terms, continuous improvement. Kai meaning change, Zen meaning good, so it's really change for good. So it's really basically a mindset that is embedded to say you're putting in systems to lead to continuous improvement. 8 waste, that's a common one, a waste identification tool. It's usually referred to the acronym. Some persons may know it as the 7 waste. It has evolved a bit to include non-utilized talent. So D, which stands for defects, O, which stands for overproduction, waiting, W, N, non-utilized talent, T, transportation, the I represents inventory in terms of inventory waste, M represents motion, and E, excessive processing. So are you running a process? Are you doing more than is required, or more than the customer is required to pay for? So you might say, okay, you take your car to a car wash, they wash that car, but if the person washing the car basically is spending 2 hours to buff the car, there must be a point of diminishing return. So that's excessive processing, wasting your resources in that regard. Time and motion study, that's a very powerful tool as well. It has its roots in terms of the group of work studies, method and work studies. And basically what that is doing is basically helping you to establish, again, identify waste within processes and also to identify standard times for doing processes. So by you conducting a time and motion study, you'll be able to analyze the waste within that, whether it's at a particular step within a process, or maybe it's an individual that is running that step. You can, look at the various ways and basically now standardize the time based on those optimizations that are done. In terms of, so we're moving on to another common issue that we saw. So productivity measurement. So when we look at productivity measurement, there's an integrated productivity measurement system that we like to look at, and it's from Spring, Singapore, and it follows 5 systematic steps. It's no rocket science. You'll actually see a lot of logic in terms of how it progresses. So it's from a measurement task force. That doesn't necessarily mean that if, for example, you're going to be excessive in that regard, but it's basically saying that you must have a team or somebody or a group of persons responsible for measurement in the organization, and that can be embedded in various rules. Determine what to measure. As I said earlier, if you don't know, if you don't measure, you can't manage. So what is it that you're going to measure? And then from there, you have to develop your indicator. So whatever your process is it production of patties, is it production of bauxite, whatever it is, you have to develop those indicators and design and implement in that regard. So having developed those indicators now, it's now for you to go ahead and actually put those in place for them to work and monitor. And from there, we go to monitor and reviewing. So how are these measures working? Am I feeling like I'm having a grasp on basically what I'm measuring? Can I see the differences in my operation by virtue of the fact that I'm measuring? So this is just basically a foundation in terms of setting that platform towards productivity measurement. Now, one of the things that I wanted to highlight as well is the whole context of productivity. So there are really 2 measures when you talk about productivity. You're either looking at a single factor measure, and single factor in that regard just means that you're looking at one specific input relative to the output. So for example, if labor productivity is our output per worker is maybe one of the most common measures of productivity. So value added per employee. So if you are running an organization, what value is each employee adding to that organization? So output divided by number of employees. Another one is output versus employee hours, output divided by number of hours worked per employee. And this is not an expansive list. Materially, you may be manufacturing a particular product, the output of the product divided by cost per unit of the material, output versus capital cost, again, the output divided by cost per unit capital. So there are various measures that you can actually use in that regard to so it's really, once you understand that foundation in terms of productivity, it being output divided by input, you can literally structure your measurement system based on your particular industry, based on your operation in that regard. And I want to add as well that the output, when you're looking at productivity, can either be a physical quantity or a financial value. So for example, the output could be the number of something in terms of a physical quantity. In terms of a financial value, it could be, as I showed earlier on a macro level in terms of Jamaica, output per worker, it's a financial value, which would be our GDP divided by our employed labor force. So you can take that to a micro level. If you are producing, let's say again, you're producing a particular drink or something in the manufacturing sector, you can use that physical quantity, number of drinks you produce. If you want to look at even energy productivity, you can say, okay, what are the inputs? So the input would be naturally energy. So how much energy did it take to produce that one unit of a particular output, which is maybe your drink or whatever it is in that regard. And we take it a step further in terms of multi-factor productivity, also oftentimes referred to as total factor productivity. So as you can see now, it's now looking at multiple inputs. So how are these inputs, more than one, contributing to achieving or achievement of a particular output? So an example is given here to say units of output divided by units of labor plus units of capital plus units of material. So the units of output, it could be, as I said, a physical quantity or a financial value. The unit of labor, that's an input. The unit of capital, so did you have to use a machine or whatever it is? Unit of material, what are the raw materials you had to put in? And basically you would have to determine what are those units for the inputs in that regard. Productivity is a ratio, therefore it has no units. So I wanted to make that clear in that regard. Now, I still added in one of the, even though it wasn't one of the top two issues faced, but design limitations. So some of the things that we can look at in terms of solutions towards optimizing layout, because that is maybe one of the common, within this context, one of the common issues that we're faced. So layout. So how is my space laid out? Whether it's an office, whether it's a manufacturing plant, how is the flow of this process going? In a bank, you see a queue setting up there, all of these things. So there's a methodology that we refer to as systematic layout planning that can be used to actually look at, the relationship between different steps within the process and actually optimizing that particular layout to meet that those specific relationships. So you would want to have a high relationship step far away from one that has, that level of relationship. So the logical thing to do, and those are the things that a methodology like this will ensure in terms of the relationships, in terms of a layout. And that would be very critical, especially when you're looking at manufacturing a particular good or even carrying out a service. Spaghetti diagrams is something that personally for me, we use a lot in terms of looking at congestion within a particular space. And what that does is to create or paint a picture of how bad the flow within a particular process is. So you get to see that level of confusion. In fact, if you look at a spaghetti diagram, as the word suggests, it looks very confusing. But that's the whole point of it, to highlight the issues within it so that you're able now to actually optimize using an appropriate methodology to solve and simplify the flow of that within that context. And so, as I said, there are some others. I think I highlighted three. The other two were HR challenges and finally digitization. I just want to make a quick point in that regard in terms of HR challenges. When it comes on to productivity, we want to look at it within the context to say that for example, HR challenges, there's something called a productivity link wage compensation system. So basically that's just a fancy way of saying that you're linking productivity towards an employee. So for those organizations maybe wanting to figure out how, you know, they can get in terms of an HR context, how can they get employees motivated? How can they get persons involved in the process? Again, one of the previous presenters spoke about that entrepreneurial perspective in terms of not necessarily the person owning a business, but more from the perspective of saying they feel a level of ownership in terms of running their process or whatever it is that they're doing to add value to the business. So that's another way, linking productivity to, you know, the individual in terms of, okay, you're performing this. If you're able to help us to reach this level of productivity, you receive an incentive in that regard. Because at the truth of it, guys, persons and employees, individuals play a critical role in terms of driving any process. And finally, looking at digitization and digitization as one of the things. There are several solutions in that regard. Looking at, there's something called robotic process automation in that regard that we can use as a methodology to optimize some of them. So these are just some possible solutions, some of which we've actually implemented and used at the center. And so we're just sharing in that regard. As it relates to my summary and conclusions, I want to make it clear that as engineers, and not necessarily just engineers, but generally persons in general, every individual, every Jamaican, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that productivity is incorporated in the way we operate and apply our expertise. Especially engineers, we're trained in such a way to solve complex problems. Whether it is you're an electrical engineer, civil engineer, chemical engineer, industrial engineer, it doesn't matter. The core of what you do is still driven by some form of optimization or solving a particular problem. This will lead to value-added contributions within various sectors. As I showed earlier, the various productivity numbers for sectors, industries of our economy, because the ultimate aim is for these productivity improvements to transcend upward and trickle back down in terms of if we at the foundation level of businesses improve, then naturally it will help the country in terms of what we're doing. And that's the final point in terms of ultimately this will improve productivity in Jamaica, particularly during a time when forecasts indicate a decline in our economy. So that is essentially the message that I want to share with this little case study here. And if anything else isn't taken away, I want us to all, leave this presentation thinking of ways in which engineers and others can optimize. Thank you for listening. Any questions or comments, feel free.
Thank you, Jonathan. It is interesting because you have given us a calculation how we can work out our productivity. I'm sure many persons had a back of the envelope way of doing the calculation, and you have brought into the sphere how we can work out our productivity from a standpoint of our personnel on the ground. So that was useful. Also, I like the downtime, the 8 waste areas. We know them, but to put it into a nice acronym that we can all remember was also helpful and useful as well for the persons who have not done operational excellence and efficiency. That was so useful.
Disconnected.
We have seen you put together what the 80-20 rule is in terms of Pareto, and if we can just get rid of 20% of the issues, then we are more productive, and therefore your presentation was also informative where that was concerned. Sure. I know that I can take one question because I think I'm up on the time for the next presenter. Your presentation, I'm sure, will be available for us to
certainly
send out to the respective persons on the in the conference. Melissa, do you want to take a question, or do I go ahead with Mr. Udega?
Yes, I can ask a question. It was just one question.
Go ahead.
The tools presented are recognized by many engineers and managers. To what extent do you think national equality and performance policies and standards should be enforced to increase their applications in our industry? Do we need more visible and impactful quality management standards and policies?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, all of these really created a little perspective in terms of, and I'm sure as you have highlighted that these are maybe familiar in terms of these tools, techniques, and methodologies. But one of the things that we, for example, at the Productivity Center, we're trying to do is to that every opportunity that we get, we try to share, with persons, some of these tools and most importantly, and that's why I kind of started out with the why in terms of why are these things very important for us to actually implement in terms of actually getting a level of compliance then, so to speak, from persons. For example, business leaders, persons who are at the helm of organizations, they have a role and I think a responsibility in terms of included in their policies. There's opportunities for the application of some of these tools and techniques. And so it brings us back to the fundamental point to say that as individuals, as business leaders, as engineers, we have a role to showcase the importance of some of these tools and techniques to ensure that the value is seen and that they can be implemented.
Jonathan, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, you're not hearing me?
Go ahead, Jonathan. We got the end part of it in terms of the question. I think we were having a back feed from someone.
No,
Melissa, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just basically saying that it still comes back to us, as engineers, business leaders, persons at the helm of organizations to kind of incorporate some of these tools in terms of our policies and the way we do business. Of course, the government plays a very critical role as a facilitator in some of these principles and in some of these tools and techniques. But I think there's still a responsibility upon us. And that's why it's important, as I said earlier, for us to kind of showcase the importance of some of these tools, methodologies, and what they can actually do. Because there might be persons out there that are familiar with them, but there isn't a need or a drive to actually implement them. So I think that, the necessary policies, both at the macro and micro level, can be done to actually bring about a greater level of compliance in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of Mr. Isaac's presentation, and it's interesting because all three presenters have led into how we need to be more productive, and Jonathan closed it off by showing us how we can calculate our productivity and what are the 80-20 rules that apply to our business. So I want to thank Engineer Jonathan Isaacs for a very good presentation and just linking all of what we have been seeing from the beginning of this conference about productivity and how we can move ahead with getting Jamaica ready to pivot out of this COVID. So Jonathan, thank you again for a very informative presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.